Naku po mga kameta. Ang dami kong sinabi kanina, hindi pala na on itong Facebook natin. So yun, yung mga nakikinig sa atin over YouTube and Spacers, no? They were able to listen, isang oras ba tayo nagsalita. So we were talking about, how to best answer a question like that, no? Like, who's the best president ever in the Philippines, or at least so far, sino naging best na presidente natin. So ang haba na explanation natin, ang dami kong sinahit ng mga datos, etc. So let me just do a very quick recap and also show you the graphs that I was discussing kasi yung mga ka-YouTubers and spacers natin were not able to see it. So I'll post it here so that I can also repost for our friends. Again, nako, pagod talaga 7 a.m. pa lang. Go tayo. So very quickly, so ang sinabi ko kanina, again, ito yung short version. Ang sinabi ko kanina, hindi pwede na titignan mo lang yung economic growth rate. Dahil yung economic growth rate sa ilalim ng iba't ibang presidente, may konteksto po yan. So for instance, kung titignan mo itong very long historical record, actually the highest growth rate na meron tayo, panoon pa nila President Rojas. But to say that he's necessarily the best president because of the high growth rate then, without context, doesn't make sense. Because back then, papalabas pa lang tayo sa World War II, sa destruction of World War II. So may tinatawag na parang base effect. Ito yung Reconstruction era. And not to mention, napakababa yung, also speaking of base effect, napakababa yung per capita income natin. So Philippines was a low income country, only a few $100 back then. So it's very easy to have high growth rates when you're at the lower levels of per capita income. No? So, hindi mo pwede sabihin na best president si President X dahil lang siya ang pinakamataas na growth rate. No, you have to put it in context. And we also explain, what's interesting is that actually the worst growth rates we had was not when we had democracy, but actually when we did not have democracy. So you clear can see here, the worst numbers here was in the early 1980s, especially 1983, 1984. And guess what? This was not under Corazon Aquino or Quirino or Pinoy, or you know what I'm saying? It was towards the end of the Marcos dictatorship. The numbers are very clear, right? Now, but then again, Marcos also had high growth rates before that. It's just that he stayed too long, and there was so much mismanagement in the late 1970s that really laid the foundation for the economic collapse that would come. So I always said these things have to be put into perspective. Now, the second thing I also said is that it's not enough to also look at economic growth rate alone. Assuming consistency of economic growth rate is what you want to look at. The other thing you have to look at is whether this growth is benefiting people. Inclusive ba itong growth na yan? Beneficial ba ito sa ating mga kababayan? And this is where I showed some other data to show to you guys na actually hindi ganun ka impressive yung performance ng halos lahat ng presidente natin is because even when we had high growth rates, hindi nag-benefit yung ating mga kababayan. So I showed you, for instance, this data by the World Bank, right? Back then by Kunishi, by the Philippine World Bank country director, a Japanese economist, Mr. Konishi, who said that in 2011, 40 richest families took home 76% of newly created growth. So if ang growth rate natin was 6-7%, more than 2/3 of that just went to 40 richest families. Guess what? That was the worst rate of growth concentration anywhere in Asia. By twice worse than Thailand. So let me bring out the numbers. Twice worse than Thailand, incomparable to the situation in Malaysia, Japan, and some of our other neighboring countries na have more sustainable growth, no? Let me just pull out the numbers. So ito. The other thing also is, if you look at it, the Philippines also has one of the most concentrated economic systems. Kaya nga dun sa The Economist magazine's Crony Capitalism, ito yung sinasabi ko kanina, no? Na the Philippines actually is way worse. So, highest in Asia yung Philippines, right? 76% yung... So, kunyari, gumawa tayo ng 10,000 pesos na extra every year, 7,600 pesos went just to 40 families out of more than 100 million Filipinos. That's crazy. In other countries, so in Thailand, it was 3,370 pesos. In the Philippines, it was 7,600 out of 10,000. Sa Malaysia, it was only 500. And sa Japan was only 200 that went to the 40 richest. That just gives you an idea how crazy the level of inequality in the Philippines has been, even in the periods of high economic growth rate, right? So again, if you just look at economic growth rate, you're really missing the picture, right? Okay. And then I talk about also crony capitalism index. So this is an index by the Economist magazine that looks at concentration of economic growth and wealth generation in few major conglomerates, otherwise known as, I don't know, cronies, oligarchies, or conglomerates, right? The more, let's say, neutral term. Well, the Philippines ranking actually was fifth worst in the world in 2014. By the end of the Digong time, it was fourth worst in the world, right? So actually, lumala pa yung situation, right? But again, you can see under either of the presidents, whether you're Pro Aquino or Duterte, hindi talaga significantly naayos itong problema ng concentration of growth in few conglomerates. So again, so we also talk about, for instance, the Gini coefficient. So we said that if you look at Brazil, they have a worse concentration of wealth. So one being the highest, meaning all wealth going to one person more or less. Zero being closer to zero means wealth distributed to everyone, right? So Brazil went from super high numbers to still high numbers, but at least the decline is steep. In the case of the Philippines, I don't know why it doesn't show the graph, but if you look at the Philippine case, there was a dip over the past 10 years, medyo nag-decline, pero still mataas. Not as high as Brazil, but super high compared to other Asian countries. And definitely incomparable to the Norways of this world. So in the Philippines, you see the small dots here, beyond 40, right? So that's the score of the Philippines, right? Depending on what measurement, it could be 0.4, if it's 1, if it's 100, then it's 40. Right? Okay, so I provided multiple indices to show that if you just look at growth rate alone, you miss the picture. You miss the context. And you make questionable judgments. Nevertheless, I said the best way to assess a president is to see what he inherited and what he passed down to the next administration. Right? And if you look at it, in fairness, more democratic and reformist presidents did slightly better, or more than slightly better compared to the more authoritarian leaders, right? Now, of course, the pro-Digong camp would say, why nagkaroon ng pandemic? But of course, my counter-argument would be, kamusta naman performance of Philippines compared to other neighboring countries, right? Compared to Indonesia, compared to Thailand, compared to Vietnam, right? 5 quarters of recession in Pilipinas in 2020, compared to Vietnam that had economic growth rates. Indonesia had a 3% decline, sure, but the Philippines had more than 9% decline. So, even compared sa mga kapitbahay natin, sobrang palpak yung management ng economy during the pandemic time. So, yung excuse na, well, you cannot compare us to Pinoy time because they had no pandemic. Well, let's compare to neighboring countries during the same time at super palpak pa rin. So, I don't know. It's not very hard to argue that had someone else been the president during the pandemic, the Philippines perhaps would have done better. At least slightly better, right? Okay. So that was what I was talking about. Now, when you assess presidents, put it in the context. Numbers alone do not tell you the full truth. And numbers can easily be twisted. Madali spin yung numbers just to make some questionable argument. You have to put them in context. And obviously, when it comes to presidents, popularity alone also is not an indicator of economic success, of efficiency and greatness. I mean, by that standard, Aquino and Duterte are way above everyone else. But does anyone seriously think that really these two are the best presidents we have had by just looking at their popularity numbers? No. I think no one in his right mind would say that that's the only way to assess whether a president is best. So yung mga pro-popularity dyan, I don't know about it. And not to mention, I didn't say this a while ago, but suspecha ko, a lot of the popularity of Tatay also had to do with the climate of fear. Now, there was genuine love and support, whatever, sure. You connect the dots, but there was definitely also a lot of, fear that, when you're in fear, you kind of, this is what I'm talking about. Nearly 8 out of 10 Filipinos feared EJK in 2019. So this was a society in fear. So how legitimate is expression of love under conditions of fear? I always ask that question. I always ask this question, right? You can connect the dots yourself. So, ako sabi ko nga bilang isang guro, I do not impose unreasonable standards on my students. The Philippines is not Norway. The Philippines is not New Zealand. So you cannot assess the Philippines by the same metrics, right? There are things that presidents in Philippines can do that no president can do in other real democracies. I'm talking about bad things. And in the same way, there are many great things that the president of Taiwan can do or Korea can do because they have strong state institutions, robust civil society, checks and balances. It is very hard for a president to do in the Philippines. I mean, even if, minsan nga kung mabuti kang presidente, lalong mas mahirap sa mga konteksto ng katulad ng Pilipinas because ang daming mga trapos, ang daming mga interest na hindi magkaroon ng tunay at magandang pagbabago. Hindi lang tunay na pero magandang pagbabago, right? Dahil nakasalaling interest ng iba dyan dun sa palpak na sistema dahil silang nagbe-benefit sa corruption, sa katrapuhan, sa concentration of wealth, among other things. So, it's unfair to compare, I don't know, Tsai Ing-wen situation in Taiwan, or, okay, a little bit less dramatic because Taiwan's situation is also dramatic because of China invasion threats. But let's say Korean president, right? Yoon or I don't know, Moon or whoever. There are things that he can do that a Philippine president cannot do because the state institutions are not there because the economic model is very different in those countries. The fiscal base is very different. But bilang isang guro, may minimum standards din ako. At sabi ko, mahirap para sa akin na ma-appreciate isang presidente kung mga minimum pa lang hindi niya makamit. Katulad ng, wag sana mamamatay tao, wag sana super bad na nakaw yung isang presidente. At unfortunately, some would say, more than one or two presidents, could tick the boxes in the wrong way. That would be the argument of a lot of people, right? So, but good news is a lot of our presidents were, at least minimally decent people. In the case of Pinoy, you know that he was personally never corrupt. God bless his soul. Now, ibang usapan yung state of corruption during those days. But at least there was some sort of effort to deal with corruption, right? Did it really work fully? No. Was it a perfect administration? No, right? But then again, as I said, I think the best yardstick is to see what they inherited and what they left behind for their next administration. Ceteris paribus, with the exception of super, external shock situation. So, for instance, I said you can make a good argument also about Ramos being among our better presidents, if not the best president, because what inherited, Corazon Aquino inherited that big dip in economic growth rate you see. So she inherited a bankrupt state. Worse than that, she inherited a military in revolt, right? So first the military or a faction of military went against Marcos. The next thing they were going after Corazon Aquino, and on multiple occasions they almost killed them, right? May shrapnel pa si Pinoy, the late Pinoy, in his neck from at least one of the attempts of assassination and coup, against Malacanang back then. So, but Ramos makes the Philippines more economically stable, but more importantly, politically stable. Now, towards the end of his term, there was the Asian financial crisis, so that didn't help very much. But look at what he did in 1991, 1992, 1993, 1994, 1995. Yes, maraming problema, kidnapping, some of the very problematic privatization, yes, sure. But he also solved a lot of problems, like electricity crisis, like coup d'etats ended during his time. So you could also make an argument for Ramos as being among the better presidents, right? So for me, even more important than answering the question is to know how to properly answer the question without being partisan, without being biased, without just looking at your emotions. That's what we're doing. And you also have to always put the numbers into a context, right? Very, very important. The numbers alone do not speak for themselves. They have to be put in a qualitative context. It's extremely, extremely important. Kaya debatable yun. Mahirap sagutin yung mga ganyan ng tanong. Pero, maraming ebidensya na pwede natin i-cite to say some of the presidents were really terrible, right? Very, very terrible, right? And not just only in terms of growth rates, not only in terms of lack of inclusive development, but also in terms of gross human rights violations, in terms of being tuta of mga bully sa West Philippine Sea, so on and so forth. So maybe we should have a talk about who's the worst president, but mahabang usapan yun. But this is what I'm saying. But yun yung tragedy of the Philippines is that some of the presidents did better than the others in terms of economic growth rate, but overall, halos lahat sila nakakulang in terms of bringing about an inclusive development. And that's because none of them, despite some efforts, including by Marcos Sr., in fairness, in the early 1970s, with the Jerry Sikat and Virata and all, to build the industrialized manufacturing-driven economy. Parang by that time, medyo mahirap na, and then may mga cronies, puro mga kapalpakan, turong corruption nangyari, then the oil shocks happened, kaya hindi nag-work sa Philippines yung attempts at creating export-oriented industrialization. Anyway, you want more details? Check my Nexus episode with Lelo Claudio, our good friend. Also, as I said, hindi ko pwede sagutin itong mga tanong na to sa isang artikulo lang or isang vlog lang. That's why I'm thinking about the book, something along the lines of, I don't know, A Tragic Nation, right? Quoting from Rizal, something he said about how he felt as a Filipino when he first arrived in Europe, in Barcelona. And Secret History of the Philippines, really, yun nga. And please check at least yung Nexus episode ko with Lele Claudio, where we explain together. We look at different aspects of things. Again, I'm not in full agreement with all our colleagues and friends. Even with Lele, I feel sometimes like, parang wait lang, still, may kapalpakan din yung ibang administration. It's not enough to just blame others. But I also agree that it's unfair to just blame one president or two for everything that went wrong. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense at all. That's a pathetic partisan argument, right? So you have to assess each president depending on what they inherited and what they passed down, given all the limits and opportunities they faced. That is how you best answer the question. On that note, maraming salamat sa mga kameta. Tingnan nyo, mahal na mahal ko kayo kahit pagod na pagod tayo. 7 na yung pagod. Inulit ko pa yung buong meta ko para lang maabutan nyo ako dito kasi mukhang YouTubers and Spacers lang nakakinig kanina. So ulitin ko na naman yan. I hope you appreciated it as I made it very quick, straight to the point. The data is there, the numbers are there, check them on your own, and I hope you appreciate what we're doing because what we're doing here is to try to come up with critical thinking. Meaning, may sarili tayong pag-iisip. Meaning, hindi lang tayo nag-criticize, binabasa natin yung ating opinion based on information, data, verified data, informed opinion, educated opinion. Yun po yung gusto natin mangyari dito. Hindi lang yung partisanship, propaganda, pa-blogger, YouTuber, etc. Alright? On that note, thank you very much. God bless and maraming salamat. Thank you kay, of course, Brian Lemoncito, Maria Cruz, kay Jing Ojo, thank you very much for joining us. Kay Ma'am Jocelyn Lumberry for your support and kindness. Appreciate it. Mil Sisose, Norma Jesse. Yan, maraming mga nagmamahal sa atin. Very, very much appreciated. Alright, Kat Rodriguez, Cecil Francisco, Jerry Conto, Jess Santiago. Ayan na, pagod na ako. As you can see na, magpahinga na ako. So on that note, yan, mahal natin ang Pilipinas kasi kaya nga ginagawa natin ito. Yan. And by the way, as I said a while ago, hoping to arrange a talk at Ayala Museum soon. So we'll give you guys more updates on that. And shout out to our friends in Ayala Museum. Kanina sila Joy and Ann. And also shout out to our friends dyan sa Jardine. Thank you very much. Inulit ko yung shout out. Mahal na mahal ko kayo eh. Thank you very much for the great time. Mahal natin yung ating bansa and let's do the best we can. And I hope yung mga vlogs natin in one way or another helps you guys to make better informed decisions and form best possible opinions given all the disinformation out there, but also all the good information out there that we have to process. Salamat. God bless.